I often liken Kansas like a wagon wheel, in that Kansas, being in the middle, was the hub of the wheel, with different branches coming out of the hub of the wheel, making the wheel. We were right in the middle. We were the hub, and Burlingame was in the middle of that hub of Kansas. You had all these major roads coming in and out of Kansas, and the Santa Fe was so significant because of the extensive amount of money that was being made. We have a man who was originally from Virginia, who settled in the Boone's Lick country of central Missouri. His name was William Becknell, and he was a freighter and a drover, frontiersman.
There was a lot of guys that had tried to do a trade route across the country to New Mexico. Becknell is considered the first, legal and official guy to trek across here. Mexico had gained its independence by then.
February of 1821, Mexico had gained their independence from Spain. That really opened up the trade. Becknell worked out a deal to where, with some other traders and merchants in and around Franklin, Missouri, would then lead a caravan of wagons down the Santa Fe Trail. It took him a couple months to cross and travail the Santa Fe Road, and they traveled somewhere around 800 to 900 miles. So that is said to have really started the Santa Fe Trail. That set the tone, the precedent for that trail. It really extended, counting the tributary roads, side roads, over 1,200 miles, having begun then again in Old Franklin, Missouri, near Booneville, west of Columbia. You then go by way of Independence. Independence, of course, was the jumping off spot for the Oregon Trail, Oregon-California Trail. And then you had to make a choice. If you're going to go up the Oregon Trail, then you went northwest. But if you stayed on the Santa Fe Trail, you went by way then of Overbrook, after Baldwin, and then through Burlingame, and then Council Grove, after Withington's 142-mile crossing in that local area. And then you went southwest to the Great Bend, where the Arkansas River makes the Great Bend. Go by way of Pawnee Rock, one would go to Fort Larned, and then you went farther west and up to then Cimarron, take the Cimarron crossing, and you had then two different ways at the Cimarron cutoff, where today would be Cimarron, the community of Cimarron, Kansas. Take the mountain branch, you go on over to La Junta at Bent's Fort, down through the Raccoon Pass, through southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, go by way of the Taos ruins, and then get the Glorieta Pass, La Junta, New Mexico, before you get to Santa Fe. So you had a choice, and it was a little bit longer, a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks longer, taking the mountain branch, but there was more of an availability of water in that mountain branch, and there were fewer attacking Native Americans.
It was started as a freight line, and that was really primarily what it was for the freight haulers from Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Freighting was a major business nationally from the 1820s all the way up through the Civil War, because there was the need for commodities and goods from the Southwest.
But I think after that, then it was also a trail for people.
The Homestead Act of 1862 was written by Samuel Pomeroy, who was one of the first two U.S. senators from Kansas. And he had worked with Lincoln to push it forth through Congress. And it would be the dominating law that pretty much settled the West, including Kansas, after the Civil War. They took advantage of this Homestead Act of 1862, acquired 160 acres. All you had to do is lay $10 down at the local land office agency, and the agent would take you out to the land and see where your borders are, and then you've got a home. And it was a heck of a deal, and really then provided then for free acreage and free land essentially for farmers and homesteaders and pioneers. So after the Civil War, most of those who took the Santa Fe Trail then were pioneers and settlers. The first native peoples that lived in this area were the Kaw, or the Kansa, the people of the Southwest. They were strong allies, the Kaw, the Kansa, up here in this area, Osage or Osage to the south. So you'd see a lot of Osage up here too, as well as Kansas. But this was Kansas land where Burlingame would be. Essentially from 1600s AD all the way up to the 1830s. The first man who came in here to settle, who was not a Native American, was John Friel, but he had bought a cabin over by where the schools are here on the north side of Burlingame from the Shawnee Indians. And then he settled there and ran a trading post there. And then there were a lot of well-known names like Strite and Bratton and Allison and Titus and Hoover, a whole bunch of original homesteaders in this area that established in what would later be Burlingame. And one thing most of them would have in common, most certainly by the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, was they were free staters. They had northern sympathies, they opposed slavery. Many of them had come from New York, Pennsylvania, a few from New England. The North came in not only for abolitionist purposes, but largely take advantage of the Homestead Act of 1854, then later a Homestead Act of 62. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act being passed, Stephen A. Douglas and A.C. Dodge having written that significant law in Kansas history. It opened up settlement then for non-Indians in Kansas territory as well as Nebraska, and coerced many of the Indian nations out of Kansas. Then you see a whole group of settlers coming in 1854, 1855, and they largely settled along then the main route of the Santa Fe Road, with the first town being Eureka in 1854, and then later Council City, and then Burlingame.
It didn't really take hold until spring of '55 when Philip Schuyler arrived with the second big group. He kind of took charge of the fledgling Council City community and took leadership and began to, over a couple of years, turn it into officially Burlingame.
You've got Burlingame by 1858, 1859 being named after Anson Burlingame.
Anson Burlingame gave a retaliatory speech about freedom and about their rights. And he was really fiery. And the town folks here in Burlingame had heard about it. Let's change our name of our town to Burlingame. You know, these are the core values we want. Yeah, so the speech didn't happen here as a lot of people want this to portray. It happened in Washington, in the Senate, in the Capitol grounds, the Senate. It didn't happen here.
That people were so impressed with his speech that it was after he did that they decided to change Council City to Burlingame.
But he was well known for being an abolitionist, a free stater, supporter of the Republican Party, and one of the major planks of the Republican Party opposed slavery into the territories, including Kansas, cheap land for farmers, and a transcontinental railroad. And that's what Kansans from the north wanted. And so they named the town after him.
And I think it was 56 or 57 whenever the name was changed.
So the first structures were built in '56. Actually, the Schuyler had incredibly purchased and had shipped in parts for a huge steam sawmill, which he built right on the site of current City Hall. Everyone in town basically worked on this thing day and night. By '56, they had it done. So with the mill being completed, they had the ability to grind grain, cut lumber, and therefore allow the community to therefore flourish. He built his own house here shortly thereafter. There was the first hotel built here in 1858 by George Bratton, just down where the car wash is today, basically. It ran from 1858 to 1890 and was finally burnt. It was caught in a fire. And so it was the only Trail Days hotel. And with the discovery of coal here, the railroad decided we need to get involved in this endeavor, and they rerouted the railroad in a more southerly route. Now later on, when the railroad came to be, a ton of hotels sprung up along Seward Avenue, from the depot where Kansas Avenue meets Seward. That whole strip was, maybe 10 hotels on both sides to accommodate all the travelers. And there were also a couple of hotels downtown, post-Trail Days hotels, the Grand Central, more in the heyday of the railroad is what they served more.
where the railroad crosses the trail is the only point on the trail that the railroad does so. That's our claim to fame. I just know that when the railroad came, that pretty well put a stop to the Santa Fe Trail.
You really began to see it fizzle out back in the late 1860s with the advent of the Santa Fe Railroad. Rail crosses trail, rail replaces trail, because why take trail and long distance when you have the railroad available?
You know, the first train arrived after the fall of '69. They've been building the turntable in the depot, years prior to that to get ready. But it was a big deal.
Yeah, the trains had a big impact on this community, a big impact. And all these little towns that really kind of no longer exist, even between here and Osage City, we're along the railroad.
I went to work for the Santa Fe Railroad in 1968. Spent 38 years there, coming through Burlingame on the railroad tracks.
You know, that used to be our main transportation, the railroads. Never did ride a train, always was going to, but never did.
I said, you look at that picture up there with the depot and the train, and you think how important that railroad really was to towns like Burlingame.
I can remember the old depot down there when the old trains come in.
Some trains were solid trains of just grain. Some trains were solid trains of just cattle back in the day.
When we lived out to Fostoria, the railroad tracks was just north. And every once in a while you'd see a streamliner go through. And that was really something. And us kids would run over there to see that train, and you'd see people sitting in the window eating, and I thought, every time I sit on a train doing that, I think about that.
When I was in, I believe it was 6th grade, they just come up and do Super Chief train, big fancy train, and all the towns around, the kids got to ride to Kansas City in that to go to the zoo.
I only worked passenger a few times. I was qualified to work passenger, they said. But I never did work passenger as a regular job. I always worked freight.
I know there was a lot of train tracks around here, spurs that fed off into different coal fields and coal mines. Of course, the Manhattan-Alma Burlingame line that used to run off out of town to the northwest was used to haul coal and cattle and other goods out of Burlingame.
I got to listen to a lot of stories of old railroad engineers on the Santa Fe that worked with steam engines. I was a conductor, and they were always quizzing me about Burlingame because of the Alma branch.
There was a train, they would go out of Burlingame and go to Harveyville and Eskridge.
Harveyville, Eskridge, and Alma. Shouldn't pass up Hessville.
And we were known to skip school and take the Polly Plug up there. That was the first train I ever rode.
I think back in the day they did call it the Polly. Yeah, it was referred to as Polly. The Alma branch was always an interesting place to a lot of us railroaders because they didn't run very many trains up there, and it was scenic. When you've made it to Alma, you're in the Flint Hills. Did you know you can run a car down the railroad tracks? I've been all the way to Alma on a 1951 Chevrolet car with no body on it. You could put that thing in low, second, or high. You could put it in high and just idle along at like about 20 miles an hour, and you've never had a smoother ride in your life. We just glide through the country, through them pretty hills. And we called it the Moon Rover.
Then you had the coal mining industry. Coal mining was big around here in Osage County.
Oh, there's so many mines around here.
Awful lot of coal mined throughout Osage County.
There was coal mines here when I was in grade school, right up the road here in a half mile. We had 2 of them going all the time.
My grandfather McLeod, he worked in the coal mine, and so did the Huskies in here. Both grandpas worked in the coal mine. And there was no coal mine in me. I worked in them a lot, but I just didn't get interested in them.
And down in Fostoria, they had a lot of Italians and English, Welsh, whatever they were, because they just come over here for coal mining. My grandfather's name was Robert Dunn, and his brother Matthew Dunn and brother Henry also came from England. Then they were coal miners.
There in the early 60s, this Burlingame was full of old coal miners. Poor old guys coughing and hacking, still spitting up that black stuff.
But a lot of Burlingame was connected to the coal mine. You know, there were a lot of mines at one time. Everybody was a coal miner.
It was a company out of Pennsylvania, via Kansas, called the Osage Carbon Company, who had made a contract with Cyrus K. Holliday, a founder of Topeka Santa Fe Railroad, that the only coal that was really to be used by the Santa Fe Railroad from 1877 to 1917, for 40 years, was coal that was mined in this area. So that created a market for communities like Burlingame and Carbon Hill, Carbondale, ghost towns like Peterton, Fostoria. There were coal mines, of course, around Osage City, Scranton. The whole area was just riveted with coal mines.
You know, it was just a solid mass of coal.
My dad personally, he started working the coal mine when he was 12 years old. He worked at Isaac's, was the last mine around here that was open, and he worked in it until it closed. And he drove the mule, pulled the cars around, and I went out there to get him a lot of times because we only had one car, and I'd go out to get him. He says, "You want to go down this mine?" And I said, "Not really."
Everybody had to have a lamp on because it was just black, you know, midnight. Even darker than dark.
I said, "Well, how bright's that light?" He said, "That's a 200-watt bulb that looked like a matchstick." I said, "Nope, I don't need to go down there." And 2 weeks later, it caved in.
Grandma's house, she had this humongous furnace downstairs, and Dad would bring in the coal for it. And I remember going out there to that coal mine with him 2 or 3 times, you know, and stuff. It was just fascinating to me to see those things coming up from down under, you know, those carts full of coal they'd bring up.
You had a cage in there, and one would go up and one would go down, you know. And they'd put their little box cars on there and take them down. My dad was a machine operator. We'd go out a lot of times on Saturday and Sunday and cut coal, you know. The machine would do the cutting underneath the coal. You'd go back in there and drill the holes and set the dynamite off and blow the coal down. And then you had to go in there and pull it apart and throw the coal in the little box car. And you had to take everything back to the tunnel. And when you get far enough back, well, you'd lay another 20-foot track, you know. Just keep on going, you know, you just kind of went in a circle, around in a circle. In each coal mine, there were probably 25 miners. You're laying down all the time, on your back, on your stomach, or on your side, or something, you know.
I never did have to worry about working in the mine because I couldn't got in the vein. When them guys was crawling around pushing this coal out with little picks, only 18 inches tall, 17 or 18 inches is all taller that was.
It was a hard job, but it was a job. Some of them, you know, didn't have anything at all to do. So.
Them coal mines were tough. They were just made out of steel.
That was quite a lie. I wouldn't have wanted to done it. Them guys actually pushed that coal out on them cars and put it up with their feet, them big chunks.
They'd kick it in the damn boxcars. I don't know how they did that, because there wasn't enough room to stand up. You had to lay down.
They had a contest every year. Whoever put the biggest coal chunk on that car got $100. Well, that was a big deal back then. Howard Jones, he was a little short guy. Howard couldn't have been over 5'3", it's the tallest. They call him Tiger Jones. But old Howard, he loaded a piece of coal with his feet on that car that weighed 1,550 pounds.
That was good for the kids, you know, because the kids like to ride in the boxcar. That was your first initial drive, was the boxcar, you know.
You thought it was fun then?
Yeah, a lot of fun. You know, they take you down there and let you play.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, you're down there kicking coal.
The problem with the coal in this area is a dirty anthracite, and they're trying to find a cleaner coal. Finally, the Osage Carbon Company, in fear of being bankrupt, they sold out, and they sold most of their mines to local farmers. What we have as a result is that coal mining continues, but It was operated by families who pretty much mined that coal seasonally. You know, locally, the Bell mine with their many mines, the Hotchkisses, for example, they had made good business in the 20s, 30s, as late as World War II, in the 40s.
You had to lease the land that you were cutting in. But there was at one time, there was 3 Hotchkiss mines at one time.
Hotchkiss was the first one right up here, and then there was Isaac's one. That was the two that I can kind of remember.
I distinctly remember going with Dad out to Bill Isaac's mine, and I don't know the number of it, but it was just south of town, Burlingame here, a mile or two.
Yeah, he always had a mine somewhere. He had one out in Fostoria for a while, and then he finally got that one out by the cemetery there. And there was 2 Hotchkiss mines and an Isaac mine at the last.
Steve Krug told me one time in tribute that the Isaac mine, as all these other mines closed down, he bought up all the material. And Stephen said, if you ever want to make money some way, if somebody could go down, they had the big rolls of copper wire.
Old Bill Isaac approached me and Jim Mercer some years later and tried to coax us to go down in that mine and pull out a bunch of wire. There must have been a bunch of copper wire down there running for the must have been electric lights. I don't like going down in places like that. I've never been down in a coal mine, and I can honestly say I never really wanted to.
Then there were some thought that, again, the coal was not clean.
Nobody wanted to be a coal miner, and everybody wanted gas stoves instead of coal stoves, you know, and it just kind of closed up.
Really, the Great Depression in the 1930s was really the last vestige in the coal mining business around here.
But the coal mines, when they went down, they just went down.
You know, when I was growing up, Burlingame really was a neat town. It had everything.
Well, we had a lot of businesses in town. I remember back in the early 50s when I was little, I can tell you about every building on Main Street, who was in it.
You know, Burlingame, there were businesses all up and down the street.
Main Street, you couldn't find a parking place nowhere.
Early in the evening, Saturday evening, the street would be lined with people that'd be out in the middle of the street talking and everything, and you
couldn't hardly find a parking place.
No, it was,
to be honest.
there were a lot of people in town.
There was no parking on the other end of town.
There was no parking anywhere, I don't think.
A lot of people in town. Of course, on the weekends, it was extra busy.
On Saturday night, all the farmers come to town. I mean, the Main Street, they would park 2 or 3 blocks out around Main Street to come in and get their groceries.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we would get Ground's car and bring it in and park it so that they would have a decent parking place to do their gossiping. Because by 6 o'clock, Main Street was completely packed.
Back then, they brought in Scranton, Harveyville.
Yeah.
I mean, you had people from all of these towns coming in on Saturday night and stuff. You know, it was extremely busy.
Yeah, Burlingame was a pretty thriving town at that time.
There was always lots of visiting. The men would go to the barber shop, and we had, did we decide 4 or 5 barbers?
At least 5. Yeah.
Had, 3 barber shops or 4 barber shops in town?
Several barber
Yeah.
shops.
And so they could get a haircut for a quarter.
35 cents when I was a kid, and then old man Pepple gave me a nickel back.
And the women would go in and buy groceries, and then they'd go to a restaurant and have coffee and share gossip.
We had all of us grocery stores, Taylor's, Patterson's, and they was all booming. I mean, all the stores in town had good businesses.
There was Oliver's, Davis's, and by Taylor's, right in a row.
2 of them delivered groceries, didn't they?
Oh, I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
Most of the grocery stores did. I know Patterson's did.
And Oliver's did, and Taylor's did, some.
My mom ordered from Oliver's grocery store, where it's Bees Restaurant.
Bees Restaurant had Bees
And
Restaurant.
they would bring it to the house and bring it in and put it on the kitchen table whether you were home or not. And they'd wrap a candy bar up in the bills and put a rubber band on it. And I took the rubber band off and got the candy bar.
Then the kids would all go to the movie, And for a quarter, we could get admission to the movie and a box of popcorn and a Coke.
And a Coke,
Yeah, it was a nice theater, Ritz Theater, and it did a good business.
Love that movie theater.
When I was 14, I got to work in the popcorn stand, and that was quite the thing. I made 25 cents an hour, I want you to know.
The theater, I was in that theater once when it was still, they were showing some movies.
I don't think I went to the movie theater more than 2 or 3 times because we were country kids. We didn't have the money we didn't come to town a lot.
My favorite place was my dad's pool hall. Play pool, drink pop, and eat candy bars. That's where I grew up at.
Spent a lot of time there myself playing pool. Jimmy Allen was a good pool player. He's younger than me about 2 years, too, but he still beat the hell out of me in that pool. Fat hired him and another kid to play pool for anybody that wanted to play.
It was kid friendly. You never saw drunks in there. A lot of guys playing cards and playing pool and them good old big old snooker tables. It was really fun to play on. You had to be good to beat some of them old guys in there.
Them old men would come in there and had 2 tables. Usually just one, but sometimes they'd have 2 tables with 7, 8 people around each table. Remember watching Old Man 2 and Pat O'Hara, Scotty Bill, a lot of them, they come up every day and play snooker. That was quite the game back then. And they played high-low partners. The person at the highest score and the lowest score to enter the red balls were partners. The Old Man 2 was usually always the top. He'd always have, 20, 30 points or whatever. And old Pat O'Hara, he'd wait till he didn't make nothing. He'd always be 2's partner, and they'd argue about that.
Mets had one down the street. Can had one across the street. But Fat's places where we always hung out at. Because he'd put up with us.
They had a skating rink upstairs. It was 50 by 100, a big skating rink.
And there was a stairway to go up to that big skating rink. And if you went clear to the north side of the skating rink, to that wall, you could look down into the pool hall.
Skating rink?
Above my dad's pool
I
hall.
lived there for a while.
A lot of people used to skate in that place.
Oh yeah, hell yeah.
Well, I've heard a lot of stories about it and friends talking about it, but I never did get to skate up there.
They told me I could skate before I could walk. When I got older, I could take my buddies up there and I sneaked the key out from my dad. Oh, Wayne Denny, and Gary Croucher, Kurt Stout. And we played like hockey, but we used a gallon can and 2x4s.
His old daddy had that pool hall and he got them candy bars.
I said that was my main meals, Darryl.
Well, I didn't even have a candy bar.
Oh, I like them cherry mashes.
Well, I did too, but I couldn't afford them.
My dad ran that pool hall from probably early to mid 30s up to 60. He died in 69. So he ran it almost 30 years.
And then if you went down the street a little bit to the east, you went up along stairs and there was an opera house up there with a great big huge dance floor and a stage. And
the old opera house where the VFW had a dance above the co-op building. Co-op was underneath of it. The dance hall was upstairs. It was a big building. They had dances up there every Saturday night.
Well, we went roller skating there, and they had dances there once in a while, but we roller skated up there. And that was neat because your hair would come home just filthy from the dust that roller skates made. 2 of my brothers had restaurants in Burlingame. Now Sam, my oldest brother, and Leona, his wife, they owned it was like a railroad dining car.
It was an old Pullman car is what it was. I think my sister Rosie was
Had 2 rows of booths on each side and just all the way down.
Had a pinball machine and a jukebox in there too. Remember? Yep. And kids would fight see who got to play the pinball machine.
And you had more Link in there.
Well, you didn't give her no static.
So they had that quite a while, and then they sold it. Then my brother Howard, him and his wife, Darlene, who was a Parker, had a restaurant down here. Seemed like we're good at feeding people anyway, because, we've always cooked so much.
Sats was a popular place to go get ice cream.
Oh, boy,
Park
yeah.
in front, and kids gathered there after every practice or every game,
it was McFarland's first, and then it was Satzler's.
Then Satzler's.
And I
had the ice house.
Yeah, and then Satzler's took over the ice house too, because they sold ice.
On the ice plant, the front of it was an ice cream parlor, and they made the ice cream there. Of course, I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and about 9:45 when everybody started closing, they drifted down to get some ice cream, I just keep my fingers crossed that nobody'd come in and we could go home.
Beverly Hardware was there all the time I was growing up. Glenn's motto was, I have it if I can find it.
You know, back behind Beverly's Hardware was Shorty Steinley's blacksmith shop. And that's where all the farmers took their equipment, if it broke, to get it welded back together.
Old Shorty Steinley, about 5 foot tall, and he had arms bigger than my legs, didn't he, Darryl?
Yeah, that guy was
Pound on that steel.
And kind of patient too, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
he put up with those kids all the time.
You go in there and say, Shorty, they told me I can't get this fixed. He says, just leave it and come back later. He fixed it for you. He done it all. He come from Germany. I think he's 17 when he come over here.
His name is Ernest Steinley. He was a German immigrant.
I don't know where he was at when he first blacksmith, but he worked for Dirk Beverly for years.
That's the only place I ever knew him.
Yeah.
An awful lot of need for blacksmith back at that time.
Oh, yeah. Them old farmers bring them old broken equipment in there and he'd get it welded up and passed. They didn't go to the
Made
store and buy new.
horseshoes, shoot horses, anything you wanted to do.
But I say they didn't go to the store and buy new, they get it fixed.
But the blacksmith shop sort of went the way of the ice plant. It outgrew its time.
Of course, we had the hotel, lumberyard.
Lumberyard, we had a lumberyard.
I worked for John back at the lumber yard when I was in high school yet. We had a nice lumber yard here.
We had car dealerships.
Well, as Holmes and Fernew ran the Alice Chalmers dealership on the south side, and then you had Swede Seastern for a while, ran a dealership on the north side up at the west end of town. They had a couple farm implement dealerships.
Wilkins had the tractor dealership.
And then there was Harkness Variety Store,
Yes.
which was next to
And then
Taylor's.
became Hogel's.
The Harkness was a department store, and they had clothing and shoes. That was mainly what was.
Dry goods store, what they called it.
Then they also stocked all the school books. And the big seller was, of course, the Big Chief tablet. And we would always take our pencil and mark the back of the cover, make a carbon copy of the cover of the tablet. And then we also had Boyd's, which was kind of like a dime store. And they had a candy counter. They were close enough to the elementary school that we could sneak away from school at lunchtime and go down there and buy some penny candy.
Then we had, 4 or 5 beer joints, and one time 4 liquor stores.
Yeah, there were more liquor stores than churches at that time.
There was either 4 or 5 liquor stores or 4 or 5 beer joints too. Pool halls and beer joints. And by the time I was 21, I'd been in all of them, I'm sure.
On Friday and Saturday night, most of the beer joints were on the east end of town, but the kids had the whole west end just full of cars. They'd go around and around and go up and down the streets, just go in circles. It was kind of silly, but that's what they used to do. Drag Main.
Another one of the fun business I remember was the bakery, Pat O'Hara's Bakery, and it was located where the bank is.
Yes,
Down there.
yes.
So
There was a bakery called Pat's Bakery. It was a 2-story building. They lived on the 2nd floor. Well, they had a bakery down below. They baked all their own goods. Wonderful goods.
and they made the best homemade donuts and rolls and everything.
And an applesauce cake that was to
Yeah,
die for.
It was, yeah, it was.
Don
it
had
was.
relatives that would come back from California, and the very morning they were back, they'd beeline down to Pat's Bakery to get cherry rolls and pineapple rolls.
I get that every morning when I was going to high school. I'd stop and go to the side door in old Pat O'Hara's Bakery, and I'd knock on the door, and old Pat'd come to the door, and, "You want your donuts?" And I says, "Yeah." I get 6 glazed donuts fresh out of grease every morning. Stop by Willard Taylor's grocery store and get a quart of chocolate milk. And I'd go over to the pool hall and eat them donuts and drink that chocolate milk. He had a great bakery, didn't he, Darryl?
Oh, yes.
He made them cherry rolls, pineapple rolls, cinnamon rolls, made a lot of candy, made that taffy. There was a great big stick of it. Boy, it'd last you all day.
There was Joe Thu's drugstore, which is where
Rick Goddard's
law office is now.
Had a soda fountain front. And,
Magazine rack, which
magazine rack, had little tables, you know, you could set up the fountain or that, and then towards the back, it's just like a typical drugstore.
My friend Terry Nolan lived up the street from me, and on 4th of July, we looked up the combination that you need to make gunpowder, and we went down to Joe Thew and gave him the list of stuff we wanted. He very calmly gave us all the little bottles with all the different stuff in it, and we went back to our house and we mixed it all up and got us the piece of pipe and drilled a hole in it. We filled it with this gunpowder, but it never went off. I think old Mr. Thew was smarter than we were.
Dr. Skank was our doctor, and he was upstairs, kind of above Thew's drugstore.
You know, when they say, well, yeah, the doctor's office upstairs, and if you could make it walking up the flight of stairs, that was the first part of your physical. Well, you're pretty healthy. The party wall agreement between my building and the building next door, I think that agreement's dated 1880 something or 1890 something. Even though the stone in the front says 1902, that's a pretty old building that I'm in. The party wall agreement is a lot of the buildings are built, and when they're built one right after the other, they'll have a similar wall. The wall will be shared. Some of those older buildings are, you know, maintained, structurally they're still good.
You know, we used to have a lot of buildings, and it's unfortunate that people have let them go, but I know it takes a lot of money to maintain that stuff too.
You know, they didn't think of spend a little money and fix them up, they just tear them down.
We tried to do a study to help preserve our Main Street because buildings were getting bad. After the guy did the study, the Main Street, the 2 blocks of Main Street, could have been a historic district. There was enough buildings at that time to qualify. What he said was you could go in there and build a metal building as long as you retained the storefronts. And that's what they were looking at. And the fronts went away. They're just holes now.
But it's still a treat to come over that hill and look down into the old Burlingame streets, the wide streets of the Santa Fe Trail.
We moved to Burlingame. We bought a house down on 122 Jackson, right on the corner of town. We started to school here and really enjoyed it. It was quite different.
Rode the school bus every day. Whenever I went to school here, it was 4 rooms.
This room right here is where I went to the 2nd grade at, Mrs. Kazir. Mrs. Kazir was a teacher here when I went to school in here. This room right here was the 2nd grade, across the hall was the 1st grade.
1st, 2nd, 3rd upstairs, 4th over here.
I went, of course, here in the Schuyler building 4 years and then graduated from the Lincoln building and started the junior year of high school down there.
First 4 grades were here, and the next up to graduation was at the Lincoln building.
And it was
5th
there.
through 12th.
My class was the first class to go to the current building.
Back when he was in football, they would dress down at the dressing room at Lincoln School and then go down to the football field. And there was a lady named Mrs. Wise that lived across the street from Lincoln School. And the guys would go through her yard with their cleats on.
The cleats on your football shoes, it wasn't comfortable walking on the sidewalk, and besides it was slick. So we'd walk beside the sidewalk, and by the time you do that every day, and you have about 30 boys do that, there's no grass. And one day we were going down there, and the pairs were right, so we just put our helmets on, because she couldn't tell who we were if we had our helmets on. And we ran over there and we got a pair and we ate it going down there. Mr. Bell was the football coach, and he said, y'all gather around here. He said, y'all think you're really smart, but I just got a phone call before I came down here that some of you picked some pears, and you aren't as smart as you think, because she gave me your number.
Worked with John Fass, Pontiac dealer, 1 year while I was still in school. They had a program then, you could take half a day. You could go to school in the morning, take half a day, made 35 cents an hour.
You could work in the afternoon and go to school in the morning, and the afternoon work would give you 2 credits. And so I worked for Glenn Beverly. We ended up having a lot of fun, and Glenn was a real neat guy to work for anyway.
Oh, and we always had an end of the year picnic when we were in grade school. And that
All
was a
school.
deal.
Back in those days, you went to Lincoln Building, then your playground area was the Sumner Park. But when school was out in the spring, there was a big picnic, more or less, in the park.
Huge
Huge
picnic.
for all the school kids from first grade through high school.
Yeah.
We would go over there and we would put on the program. Each class would do a little part for that, and then parents would come, and it was a big deal.
We had games and the band played.
Potluck dinner.
And then after the dinner and everything, they could go down to the ball field and there would be always a softball or a hardball game going on. That was back when, in the central part of the park where the bathrooms are now, there was actually a
Big
bandstand. I read the most books, I guess, in the 4th grade as a result of it. I got a box of candy at the end of the school year. But then I also had to get up on that stage at the end of the school year and recite something to the audience, standing up on that stage in that gazebo in the center of the park. And I thought, man, that's punishment. As kids growing up, what do you think of an education? You really don't give thoughts to that. But looking back now, I think we got a good education.
The three of us had the same first 6 school teachers. Bonnie Rodecker,
Laura Kazir,
Laura Kazir, and then
Lena
Lena
Crum.
Crum. I did not have her.
Helen Meyer.
Helen Miner and Mary McFarland, Angus's mother, and Pearl White.
We had good teachers. We did have good teachers. Miss Crum was my first one here in the 3rd grade.
Carolyn Strom came, she was my best friend all through school, and she came in 3rd grade and said Miss Crum was her introduction to public schools.
Well, in my 3rd grade, I had Miss Crum. She was a maiden lady. Scared me to death. But after we got older, we found out she was really a nice lady.
She was a single lady and was very firm, but was really nice as long as she behaved herself. It was a lot different from the one-room school that Carolyn had been going to.
Helen Miner was the one in the 4th grade.
I had her for 5th grade also, and she was strict. I mean, if you spoke in her class, you had then got your name on the board, and then you'd have to write, "I will ask permission to talk." And you'd have to do it like 25 times each time you got caught for speaking in our class. There's one boy in my class that he got caught so many times, I guess it just didn't register with him or something, because he had like, I don't know, a whole bunch of marks on his name that he never did go for recess during the school year, because he always had to stay in to write it. Pearl White was our
And then
5th
we
grade
went
teacher.
to the high school,
grade.
the old Lincoln Building, and had Mrs. McFarland and she
Right.
was strict. I
Yes,
mean,
she was.
really, you didn't mess around in her class at all.
I was a year behind Angus in school, and we always heard about what a mean teacher Mrs. McFarland was. And we were scared to death. She even hit her own son over the head with a ruler.
We were scared to death. We'd heard horror stories about who was going to be our teacher.
And we got to Lincoln School for the first time, and there at the top of those steps was Mrs. McFarland waiting on us. You know what? She was the nicest person.
She was strict.
Well, we were in grade school. It's when they started having school lunches. And those were some of the hard years for farming, and so we couldn't afford school lunches. So Kenny got to,
Got the bus tables.
and then I got to wash dishes. And I was still so short that they had to have me stand on a milk crate in order to reach the sink. But we both worked in the lunchroom the whole time we were in school.
In the 5th grade, the 5th grade classroom was on the 2nd floor, which basically is right over the kitchen. And the smell of homemade bread would waft up through, oh man, boy, if you weren't hungry before then, by the time it was lunchtime, you were really hungry. That was one thing about the lunch program at the Lincoln Building, because you ate in the gymnasium for noon lunch. And the cooks there cooked their own food.
When we were in school, especially when we were in the Lincoln Building, we had open lunch hours. Most of the time, we'd walk downtown, go to Boyd's Variety and get some penny candy, walk back to school.
Yeah,
You
once
know.
in a while, we would jump on a bicycle or something, or ride somebody's bicycle and ride downtown. They had a place called the Diner. It was an old dining car from the railroad, and it was where Hovedstadt's garage is now, Fry's had a service station there, and then next to it was kind of an open lot, and in that open lot, there was this railroad car, it was a diner. Boy, that was a popular place for the kids to go. For 30 cents, they'd serve a hot pork sandwich or hot beef sandwich.
When I was in high school, they give you an hour lunch, and you could go wherever you wanted to. We went downtown and ate in Mrs. Link's, Link's Cafe, and then the old boxcar. At that time, Mrs. Jackson was running, and they always had noon specials for kids. At the same price as the school lunch, you'd fix your meal.
And then in 2001, the school built everything down to where it's at now, to the north. And they sold the Lincoln building to an individual that made it into apartments. Some of us decided we wanted to try to do a museum. He agreed to sell it to us for what he bought it for from the school. And that was in October of 2001.
Burningham's got this little museum right up here that shows a lot of history of what's happened in the community.
That room over there, we've set it up as an old school room. We have programs with the elementary school for Kansas Day, and they'll come up here and we'll have different activities going on for them. And one of their favorite rooms, those kids, is the old schoolroom upstairs. And if the kids come back in to visit, that's the room they head for. And there's not many of the old country schools left anymore. The museum has the rights to this one that's just south of town, out here on the highway, called Superior School.
Well, Berlou went to Superior School, country school, for the first, 2 years?
For 1 year.
1 year?
1 year and about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
We started school here, first grade, we didn't have kindergarten back then. There was a big old potbelly stove right here that we had to help the school mom keep going, or it's cold.
I remember the restrooms. The girls were the north or the southwest corner. The boys were on the northwest corner. And they used to play, we'd play Annie over the schoolhouse.
We never did have over, I don't know, maybe 15 kids would be the most. Of course, we was always, real polite and didn't tease the girls at all. And then they consolidated with Burningame up here, the Superior did.
And it was that period of the early 50s that they was consolidating a lot of these country schools into here.
So this is the third version of the Superior Schoolhouse. The first one was on Dragoon Creek, actually, about a mile south of here. It was brick. The second one, I'm not real clear on the location or construction of it, but this is the third one.
And the township owned that, and it was falling down. And so they asked us if we wanted to take it over, and so we did. And I think we worked on that for 5 or 6 years. And it's awesome. It's got a new front porch on it, and new windows in it, and it's been painted, and the inside has been painted, because it was a wreck. The plaster was falling off, and the roof had leaked, and all kinds of stuff. The old belfry was in bad shape, but it was leaking, and that's what ruined some of the metal ceiling. They took the bell down, and my son took the winter and rebuilt the belfry in his shop. And then they polished up the bell and, repainted it and everything. And then when spring came and the city lifted off the old belfry and set the new structure right back on there, fit perfect. Our prime purpose of that was to stop the rot and preserve over 100 and some year old school. Because Superior itself was a town, and the schoolhouse was the only part that was left. There's another schoolhouse that's on west of there on that same road, about 5 miles. It wasn't in all that bad shape probably 10, 15 years ago. One of the teachers here would take her class out once a year and visit that school and spend the day doing class in that. But it's let deteriorate, the windows are boarded up, the porch is totally fallen off, and somebody just has to take these things and love them. Just like our Main Street, we used to have a lot of buildings.
Today, there's just not enough business there, and everybody has to go out of town to find a job. So it's changed quite a bit, you know.
You just got like everybody else, you know, just the little town just kind of faded away.
And there's only one reason why Burlingame is what it is, because there's no people, no population. No population, you can't run these hardware stores and beer joints and all these hotels. It just doesn't work that way.
These small towns, it's just like a farmer. They've got upkeep on the electrical and water lines and all that, so it all everything reflects everybody in the community.
I just think that we learn from history, and unfortunately our community has lost a lot of history. That is really the reason why a group of us decided that we wanted to try to help preserve it by forming this historical society. We started a museum and we preserved a building.
I thoroughly enjoy our town. I really do. I think it's a great town. I'm sorry to see that our business is downtown, that we've got so many empty vacant lots, but that's the way things go, I guess.
It's like every other town. It's got its good points and bad points, you know, and one thing I like about the smaller community, everybody knows you. If you get in trouble, you can usually find somebody, and in these bigger cities, you don't even know your next door neighbor. I think the kids grow up with a broader spectrum of what's going on. They're not tunneled in one place, you know, and it's more down to earth, you can see.
With the exception of 7 years, I've been here all my life, and that's too many years to tell. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it all, and having these girls as my sisters has been a pleasure. I got a son and a grandson trying to work into the farm, be the 5th and 6th generation, so I hope it works out.
Ever since I was 14, pretty much all my years lived in Burlingame area, and today I'm still living out there on a piece of the original farm that we came to in 1961. And the house we grew up on out there is right basically within a quarter mile of the Santa Fe Trail, so I get to visualize out of my own head what that might have looked like back in the day, watching the wagons rolling west by there.
But I think what makes Burlingame so important is because it was such an early community with it being on the Santa Fe Trail. Santa Fe Trail helped make this town. Now, this community was designed well for that era. And when you go to Burlingame, downtown Burlingame today, it is, if you will, then reminiscent of that era. And I think that's what helps make Burlingame remain its historical integrity, is its Main Street in particular.